to do today is try and give you a bit of an overview, try and give you a love of carpets, try and give you a taste for them. What I could do is probably, just take you on a very boring chronological journey through that, but that's not what I do. I'm going to give you bits and pieces and what I call juicy bits. So again, I'd like to give you an idea. This is also from that book. What Mohammed Reza, who was showing Brian Murphy around the bazaar, was saying is something like this: a carpet is poetry in itself. You just have to learn to read it. So think about it that way. And what he often does is recommend that you read poetry about the rugs. Now, I love poetry, and I've looked for poetry about carpets, and I've got an interesting one too. Perhaps I should. No, I'll save it when I've got it there. Okay. So he says there is never one way to look at a carpet. You cannot say this motif has this meaning. It's not quite that reductionist, okay? What it is with a carpet, I find, is more like Shakespeare, if we're going to compare it to poetry. You know, when you when you see a good Shakespeare play, or indeed if you go and see a concert played by live musicians in a concert hall, it doesn't matter if you've heard that piece of music before. It doesn't matter if you've seen Hamlet before. If you see a good production, you see a whole lot of new things, and you appreciate the beauty of this new production, or whatever they've done with the new production indeed. I think a carpet is like that. As I say, I've got 17. I move them around my house. Every time I look at one of those, I see something different. Not only are the colours affected by the weather and so on, but you notice little things, even in the most simple carpet. So this is why I think they are an unending source of beauty and pleasure. A thing of beauty is a joy forever, I think Keats said at one stage. So let me see if I can give you some background bits so that you can understand just a little bit more of what to get out of them. Let me see. One interesting tidbit that I have here is that they were so appreciated all through history by Europeans. We tend not to either know the story of how much Europeans have not only depended on Persian goods, but also loved Persian luxury goods. So not only did they need the pitch, which was basically solid petroleum, which they put in the torches, that they put in the sconces of the castle walls so that they could light the castles. Not only did they have to trade with the Persians for that, but they wanted to trade with the Persians for beautiful glassware, for beautiful carpets, for beautiful perfumes, rose water and things like that. So there's been a long history of exchange there. So one of the things they really got into around about the 16th century, when these beautiful Safavid carpets came on the market, was there was an absolute craze for them. If you think about it, up until then, think your English monarchs. What did they have on the floor? Carpets? No, rushes. And there's a good reason for having meadowsweet on the rushes of the castles of Queen Elizabeth I. It smells nice when you walk on it, and it gets them, the early rushes will get some of the mud from your boots and so on, all the rest of, there are all sorts of practical reasons for having rushes, and you can just pick them up after a few days, throw them out and get a whole lot of rushes, new fresh ones. But after they got some beautiful carpets in, then they started putting carpets down instead. And this is when now it was called the Turkish market, because by now Persian territory was taken over by the Ottoman Empire. So this was basically Turkish based. It still used Persian aristocrats as the bureaucracy and pretty much as the power brokers. So if I use the word Persia generically to indicate it was still very much a Persianized culture, that is what I'm referring to. Nevertheless, the Ottoman Empire, this is why in this time they're often called Turkey carpets. So what there was this incredible fad for these sorts of carpets, and they started being depicted in European paintings. So that you'll see that, for example, 18th century European paintings. In the 18th century, the big drink of the day was tea. And they often depicted households with the lady of the house, who now had a new prestige because she presided over the making of the tea, at a little table with all the makings of the tea, with her son and daughter, and they'd all be done in silk brocade, father standing at the back, done up in his silk brocade, and she's there, and guess what's at their feet and hanging on the walls? Persian carpets, okay, or Turkey carpets. If you think of those pictures of Henry VIII, he's standing there and he's got that huge belly and all the rest of it. Have another look at that very famous painting. I have it in one of my magazines there. He's standing on a Persian carpet, the Persian carpets all over the walls. His son, Edward VI, the little man who didn't last as king very long, absolutely in Persian silk brocade and Persian carpets. I mean, these people were defined in many ways by Persia, in a way that we don't often see. So that's an interesting aspect of part of it as well. Meanwhile, back in Iran, or Persia, not only were they called it Persia in those days, not only were they having absolutely beautiful carpets to be displayed in the royal monarch's court, but they also, back in more modest households, were using carpets just in an ordinary way as their ordinary floor coverings. And let me give you a picture of how that might have looked. What they had was an arrangement of 4 pieces, and they still do this today. It is so clever, let me tell you. There is, in say, a basically rectangular room, you would have the so-called headpiece at the wall of the room that is considered the front of the room. And that headpiece, which is a long piece, is called a kalegi. And then you've got a main carpet, which is called your mian farsh. Farsh is the Farsi word for carpet, farsh. So that's fairly large. And that obviously would not quite fill the room. And if you moved, you'd need your main farsh to be one that would just fit in all rooms. But there might be a bit of space left down here and here. Of course there would be. And so what you would do would be to have a kenara. A kenara there and a kenara there. Now the brilliant thing about this configuration is that if you move to a smaller room or a smaller house, you simply overlap them a bit, and they still fit perfectly. So I think that's wonderful. So think of that. Has anybody ever been to a Persian household or a household in Iran and been able to see this? I have. I've not been there, but I've seen pictures from friends that have been there, and this is exactly how they do it. So that's that. Now, what would they have been made of? Mainstream carpets are made of cotton or wool or indeed silk if you're rich enough. Now they have variations on this, and these also have their advantages and disadvantages. So some of you I know a lot about carpets, and for some of you this will be entirely new. So I'll try and mix it up a little bit so that it's not too basic. But what we've got is, okay, some variations on your wool and your cotton and your silk. Goat hair. These days goat hair is not used quite as much, but it is there. Camel hair is occasionally used. The nice thing about camels is they do shed from their tail and their mane very conveniently a couple of times a year in lengths about 12 inches long, a foot long, which are very nice for spinning and making into ropes and things like that. It's not the most attractive wool in the world, but it is sacred. So it's only used in special occasions and for special artefacts. And that is because, well, maybe you can tell me, why would the camel be considered special and not for everyday use? What significance for Islam does the camel have? Quite apart from the fact that it was the ship of the desert in the caravans, of course, but the sacred thing is that Muhammad was a camel driver. He was a camel caravan supervisor before he became a prophet in a previous life. Okay, so it's considered to be sacred to him. For the same reason, a deep emerald green, which although they can make it, is very rarely used for your everyday carpet because it is said that Muhammad was buried in an emerald green shroud, and so that colour is more or less sacred to him. Now you know that you realise that this morning was the end of Ramadan, the end of Ramadan, and so you'll be maybe hearing a little bit about these things in the news. Wouldn't it be nice if we, could get a little bit of an infusion of culture to balance out some of the propaganda we get about Islam? But this is why green is not often used. A sage green is used more frequently because it's not the same green. It's also easier to make. You just boil down lichen and things like that. We've talked about that. So that's a little bit about the things that you won't see much of. What you might see camel in is these fine balishts. Now these are bags about 32 inches by 16 inches, and what they are is there's a carpet weave on one side, a flat weave actually, a gelim weave on one side, or sometimes knotted, and they're actually can be made into, they're saddle bags, or they can be sewn up and used as cushions. And these balishts sometimes use camel hair. The other use for camel hair is in dowry rugs. Now, you know that in European times, a woman would have gone into a marriage with a glory box, with a trousseau. And similarly with Middle Eastern cultures, except that that so-called glory box would have always included some rug-woven artefacts, and indeed the so-called dowry rug. This is called the jahitsi, and this is very fine. These are very rare in the West. These are not saleable items, so you won't probably have seen these. But what they are is a very small rug, which the woman starts to weave when she's affianced, when she, is promised. And the idea is that she has to try and weave as much as she possibly can. Her love is supposed to be proven by how much she manages to weave. So that's a bit of a worry. With this so-called dowry rug then turns into the marriage contract. It is symbolic of the marriage contract. And when the marriage is concluded, and of course this will vary slightly, but this still pertains over parts of Turkey today. When the marriage contract when the marriage is concluded, it will be rolled up and put away very carefully in a cupboard somewhere and never seen again. The idea is that if it is kept and protected and lasts forever, so will the marriage. So it's very much symbolic of that sort of thing. And you know, this whole idea of sacred objects being wrapped up and put away and never seen, that's also something that happens with Japanese artworks. You may be familiar that this is a Japanese medieval custom as well. We find that very strange. We're all about exhibiting things. But sometimes something is so sacred that it must never be seen. Isn't that an interesting idea? All right then. Now, wool is, as I say, the most obvious type of material to be used. It obviously was there because they had flocks of sheep. But it does have some problems. It is in fact quite elastic, as you will know if you're wearing a sweater today. Okay, and this means that it's problematic for the foundation warps. The warp is the long foundation line, and then the weft is the cross one. Okay, for warp and weft, wool is problematic because it is actually a bit rubbery. It does pull out of shape, and it might mean that you end up with a crooked fabric. You know, if somebody, or if there are two weavers, and that occasionally happens, if you start weaving very, very tight knots, and knots can either be single knots, but even they pull a couple of warps together. A so-called double knot, which is considered a better knot because it is wound more times and therefore a bit more substantial and stronger, will actually pull in 3 or 4 threads. And so if you tie a very tight one here, but by the end of the row you're getting a bit tired and you tie a looser knot, if it's wool it'll really exaggerate that and you'll end up with some rucks in it. So, and it's hard to pack very tightly. What they do is they tie the knots loosely and tie a few more, and then they have special comb to comb them down to pack them very, very tightly. Can you see how that might be done? So with wool, that is because it just bounces back a bit. Okay. So with wool, that's problematic. It's also very, very light, much lighter than cotton. So what they do these days, they tend to use cotton for the foundation and then use wool. That's great because by that time the foundation is invisible anyway. The trouble with using cotton as your foundation, although it's more traditional, it's incredibly slippery. And so in modern houses where you've often got your polished wooden floor, if you put down any carpet actually, but particularly your thoroughly woolen carpet, it'll just slip from under you, which is why, and you will know this, if you're going to buy a carpet, you must buy it underlay. There is a special slightly sticky underlay which will keep it perfectly in place. So what else have we got? Keep an eye on the time. We'll wrap up with something else here. So what you've got is this wonderful empire that was able to bring to bear all of the excitement of this huge empire that went, as we would say, all the way from Greece to India, all the way from Russia down to Egypt, and that brought together a whole lot of things to turn something which was probably a very humble thing in its early days into a really wonderful art form. And in the early days, as I say, they were probably just pelts, but they were not just pelts for the floor. Think about this. Once they got into rugs, the rug would be on the floor, a couple of rugs would be your bed, a rolled rug would be your pillow, the rug would be the door on the felt tent, because often these people did have felt tents, you know, which is incredibly mobile, so that a heavy rug for the door, rugs on the openings or windows, rugs as beautiful wall hangings, rugs for everything, rugs to keep your horses warm, you know, absolutely everything would have been rugs. So simple then to move on, you just roll up all the rugs and drive off. So your furniture is incredibly mobile. I think that's very useful. So